Hey everybody, this is my explanation guide for my learning theories matrix. First of all, I want to take you on a quick tour just to orient yourself with my matrix. So as you can see, I took somewhat of a circular approach. I'm going to be starting at the 12 o'clock position and working my way clockwise, but you are free to look at this in any way you like. The first thing that I want you to take note of is that I've color-coded each of my theories. Behaviorism is going to be marked in red, cognitivism in yellow, and then constructivism in the green. And what I've done is I've taken somewhat of a web approach, and I've taken some of my key concepts, which I'm going to be talking about, which I've denoted with a diamond shape, and I basically put each of the three theories around the central diamonds to give you a quick and, at least to me, a more intuitive way to compare and contrast each of the three theories without having to think too much about which one is which, and while keeping each of the independent topics separate from each other. So the key things that I decided to compare contrast in my three theories. First, the idea of how does learning occur. Next, which influences learning, continuing clockwise. Types of learning that are occurring in each of the processes. Next, criticisms, and this is taken quite a bit from our Canvas discussion. And then how we would use each of these three learning theories in the classroom. And then lastly, I have a few theorists here just in case you want to look up more people. And then I have my references on the bottom. And I tried to put a few relevant graphics just to emphasize a few of the points that I'm trying to make throughout my learning matrix, and I will kind of go into those as we come across them, especially this pyramid on the bottom. So I'm going to be starting at the 12 o'clock position. So the first thing that I wanted to compare in each of these three learning theories is how does learning occur? And what is the philosophical thought on each of these three theories? And I'll start with on each of the diamonds with behaviorism. So in behaviorism, what we are talking about when we refer to behavior, anybody who's in special ed, you're very familiar with this, is behavior must be both observable and measurable, which means it has to be some sort of discrete action, which means that we can see it and we can measure it. This is good for specific types of task completion or recall-oriented types of learning. However, application of said learning or understanding of any sort of higher-order thinking processes, that's not something that we talk about too much in behaviorist theory. We're more or less interested with a desired response after a stimulus and how do we facilitate a higher percentage of desired responses using reinforcement, using cueing, prompting, and things like that. Now, cognitivism, we're more interested in the cognitive process, okay, being able to organize ideas, being able to sequence ideas, being able to understand a specific process, and also, and certainly, potentially most importantly, we need to learn how we ourselves learn and take in information. So the more information that we have about our own learning process, the better by which we can take in new information and we can understand which strategies and skills we are good at and which we may not be so good at, so we can make better decisions as to the approach which we take to learn. Now, a common thing that we're going to see in all of constructivism is that learning occurs through experience. And just as a quick philosophical history lesson, this goes back to, as it was Ermer and Newby talked about a little bit at the beginning of their chapter, the idea of classical empiricism, which was reaffirmed by the modern empiricists, basically fathered by Rene Descartes, where he basically said that all of our existence and our concept of reality is derived from the senses. That's the only way that we intake data into our minds. So the only way in which we can conceptualize reality is through the way we experience it and the types of experience that we do have. So as far as learning occurs, it's when a learner or a person experiencing reality intersects with a specific experience to be experienced. Let me zoom out a little bit here. Okay, much better. Now, what sort of things influence said learning? As you can see here, I have my happy little mouse up here that says, "Will press lever for food," and I thought that was a great way of showing this idea of behaviorism. Whereas the mouse wants food, okay, and the mouse is willing to exhibit a specific response to gain a desired outcome. So we have stimulus, response, basically operant conditioning, if you will. So what influences learning? The way which we are able to either reinforce or otherwise provide feedback, cueing, or prompting, which are all ways to increase a desired outcome, a desired response after a stimulus is provided. And how can we basically affect the environment to maximize the amount of desired responses per unit of stimulus that is presented to a subject. So it's very base level, very low level. Now this isn't just a rat, hitting a lever to get some food. This is also basic level recall, low level maintenance rehearsal level, factual recall based information. It's something, this can be times tables, this can be specific vocabulary words, letter recognition, letter identification, things like that, by which we need to have said basic skills in order to build any sort of higher order thinking. Now in the yellow boxes in the cognitivist theory, what we start to see things that influence learning is how we learn and how information can be presented. And once again, the idea of cognitivism is to present information in a process, and to have the learner understand not only the process in which something is being presented and understand the connections that go along with that, but also understanding the self and one's own mind, how we learn, and how confident we are about our own learning. So a few specific things that can influence learning. First, the idea of demonstrations. These are all from Ertmer and Newby. He listed these. I thought these were all good. So demonstrations. When we talk about demonstrations, this must inherently mean some sort of discrete action, right? Because you have to have a specific action to demonstrate something. You can't really demonstrate an idea or a concept. You can try to explain an idea or a concept, hence you have the instructional explanations right next to it. But when we're talking about actual demonstrations, that is, how do we complete a said task? So the students get to actually see the process of completion of a task modeled before them, so that they can internalize and see it laid out before them, so they can see step 1, step 2, step 3, so that they can start relaying that into their own memory and start to begin their own mental processes of, how do I do something? Okay, I understand I have to do step 1 followed by step 2 followed by step 3. And this isn't necessarily for discrete tasks too, but this can also be more conceptualized tasks, such as how do we reason, how do we problem solve, right? We identify specific problems, then we try to discriminate relevant from non-relevant factors in said problems, then we try to apply them to specific situations in which we're familiar with, or we generalize them to new experiences that we have not had a big experience base in. So that really goes far. That kind of ties into the idea of illustrative examples and non-examples, whereas we can start to form that particular student or learner's neural network as to what concepts are connected to concept A, and what concepts are not necessarily connected to concept A. So what happens is then we basically have either a little positive or a negative blip in the brain when we think about whatever it is that we're trying to think about, and our brain kind of instantly filters through the things that they have a negative blip next to it. It's like, okay, that's not related, and it goes directly to, okay, I know that when we're talking about X, that means that I really need to consider 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it develops kind of a mental algorithm, if you will, as to relative concepts, ideas, and processes as far as trying to think about something, to perform something, or otherwise. Now, again, as before in constructivism, the idea of what influences learning, there's really only two things. Okay, either the learner and the learner's past experiences and present experiences, because that's the only way we experience reality, is through experiences. And each person's concept of reality is just that, their own. That's where we get, once again, from Descartes. It's I think, therefore I am. It's this idea of one's own concept of reality is just that, their own. So we only have past experiences and present experiences. Now, another thing that does influence learning in constructivism is this idea of context, whereas we need to understand what role a specific current experience has and how it relates to past experiences, and how that's going to affect how we think about a specific idea, concept, process, or whatever it is that we're trying to learn or master. So we experience a new experience, and then it goes into our mental process, and we then try to understand the context in which the experience took place. And we think on all of our previous experiences. Now, is it a more root level thing where it's like, oh, I thought that this was the answer, but it turns out that this was the answer, on something that's low level? Or it could be something higher level where it's like, oh, I was thinking about how to solve a specific problem this way, but I should be thinking about how to solve a problem in this other way. So we experience a new experience, and we use our base of prior experiences, and we really only have two outcomes. We either affirm what we previously have experienced as still true or affirmative, or we refute what we thought that we knew, and we then go through a cognitive change, if you will, whereas we now think something different based on new information and on new context. So types of learning that occur. I know that they say at the end of Ertmer and Newby, but once again, in most circumstances, we want to have multiple levels of learning that are occurring. Hence, we need to use many of these different theories so that we can activate different kinds of levels of learning. There's absolutely a need for low-level learning, and in many instances, there is also a need for high-level learning. Now, in some instances, there may not be such a need for high level. It really depends on what it is you're trying to teach and the context in which you're trying to teach it. But at any rate, behaviorist types of learning. It's that maintenance rehearsal, low-level, recall, response to stimulus type of learning. You are asked to perform X, and you either perform X or you don't perform X. If you do perform X, you're provided some sort of reinforcement, which increases, or first of all, the reinforcement incentivizes you to perform a desired outcome. Secondly, it's also a reward. It can also be a reward for, let's say, an initial success when we're trying to teach and the actual process has not gone to, or whatever task, piece of learning has not yet gone into full mastery yet. So if we're going through the trial and error process, if we don't do it right, then we provide cueing, which could potentially be anything from verbal to visual, like a point. And we have different kinds of prompting. which could potentially be as intensive as hand-over-hand prompting. This is especially true in special education, where we have students with either more moderate or severe special needs that really do require that very, very intensive hand-on-hand prompting in order to teach a skill, and then we gradually fade said prompt. But we also use the reinforcers very liberally as well, because we want students to be rewarded and to have a positive psychological response to providing a desired response to whatever stimulus that we're providing them. Now that leads into some of the concerns, which I won't go ahead of my project, but we'll get there into a minute. Now, types of learning that are occurring in our yellow boxes in cognitivism. We're trying to teach higher ordered thinking processes, and that's not just being able to organize specific topics. For example, being able to process information, either to organize it or to sequence it or whatever, or to problem solve, which could potentially be either application, which is using something on a known situation and using a process on a known situation, or generalization, which is using the process on an unknown or a new situation, but you understand the skill set in order to handle that. Or reasoning, which is, I mean, in and of itself a very big topic, but actually developing a mental algorithm as to how to approach a specific task, process, or a problem, idea, or whatever it is that we're trying to do. And it's our mental algorithm that helps us work through that. This fourth one I put in, this is from Bonk's video on the cognitive process, this idea of metacognition, and metacognition really just being a self-awareness technique and a self-awareness exercise. What I try to teach this to my undergrads, it's when we go in and we take a test. Okay, there's only really two ways we think when we go in and we take a test. We're either A, we feel prepared, or B, we don't feel prepared. So then when we go to continue the test, when we look at a question or an item on a test, we either A, feel confident in our ability to perform or answer or whatever we're trying to do, or B, we don't feel confident. Now sometimes we have a disconnect between our initial confidence going in and when we sit down and we take the test and we realize, oh no, I guess I wasn't as prepared as I thought. That thought process in and of itself is a metacognitive process, or it's basically an understanding of one's own cognition, one's own awareness of one's learning. So this is definitely an important thing to teach and to foster in young minds, because if we want students to think critically, if we want students to think with any semblance of higher order, we have to provide and foster in themselves a level of self-awareness to the point where they put that into their own mental algorithm. Whereas you come to a situation and you either A, feel comfortable, or you don't feel comfortable, and depending on your comfort level and the type of situation or problem that you're trying to solve, or a concept you're trying to organize or process, you may take you could potentially take a more conservative strategy or approach to addressing said problem, or that you need to seek further supplementary help from a teacher, from the internet, or from something to help fill in the blanks, if you will, to help continue the process or the task. Now, one thing that's kind of special to constructivism, whereas behavioralism and cognitivism have really kind of operationally defined the types of learning that each of the schools have. Once again, learning is through experience and through the context of experience. So we're really not able to identify the specific types of learning that are happening unless we're talking specifically about the context of the experience on which we are actually participating in. Okay, so certain contexts of certain positions could potentially change rote level knowledge or understanding. Whereas you think, let's use some sort of contemporary issue on like politics or whatever, and we think that, okay, or like carbs or something, like, okay, We went forever, like carbs are bad for you, low carb is the way to go. And then you have a new study that comes out and says that, okay, these scientists have decided that, carbs are now, low carb diets are now bad for you, and they can cause this and that and the other thing. That's in the news the other day. That can change. Okay, so it's like, okay, is this good? Is this bad? Or it could be it's something even more basic than that, where it's like, okay, I thought that, I always get those two countries mixed up. I thought the capital was X, it's actually Y. Okay, so you look at a map, you experience and you see, and looking at that map, it's refuted your current concept of what the capital of, Chile or whatever it is, at a very low level. Whereas the idea of, low carb diet is good, low carb diet is bad, how I feel about a specific, issue, process, or whatever, that can change based on new experiences. It really just depends on the context of what it is you're trying to learn and whatever ordered thinking process level that is being activated during that particular process. Okay, so it's very situational and context based on the specific learning activity. So I thought it was really important to put criticisms of each of the learning theories in my matrix because even as Ertmer and Newby said, no theory is perfect. All theories are good in specific instances, but all theories have downsides in specific instances. A lot of these are from things that I've read from you guys in the discussion boards, which were really good, and some of them are my own thoughts. So, criticism of behaviorism, a lack of regard for higher order thinking processes. This is in my own practice in special education. There are a lot of detractors that are very well-respected special educators that believe, let's say, the process of applied behavior analysis for students with autism is, I've heard people use very strong language in opposition to ABA because they say it's glorified Skinner box operant conditioning. Whereas it's like, okay, does the student really understand why or how they're doing something, or is the student just mimicking or providing unknowingly providing a desired response in order to get whatever the reinforcer is, be it some food, a toy, or whatever? Do they understand why, and have they made the connection as to what is the purpose of said meaning? And I think there's definitely something to be said for that. Now, that being said, there's also a ton of special ed professionals that absolutely are in support of ABA and say that, according to the limitations that this specific disability has caused in cognitive processing and sequencing, that this is necessary, and it's how it needs to be. I think my opinion is probably somewhere in the middle, but it is also irrelevant for the context of this theoretical map. I'd be interested in some of your opinions if you have any experience with ABA and ABA therapy and your take on its relationship to behaviorism. Now, criticism of cognitivism is that to really have a curriculum and instruction that's based around cognitive processes, the person that is providing the instruction has to have a really deep understanding of cognitive processes, how the mind works, and then be able to provide instruction that's developmentally appropriate and well scaffolded in an proximal zone of development for the student to be able to make proper connections. It can't be, for example, a proximal zone or developmentally appropriate instruction. We can't have instruction that's too low because then we're not maximizing the amount of new information that a student can take in, and we're overlapping and kind of double dipping on old information, so we're not getting the kind of progress that we could. On the other side of that coin, we could potentially have a lesson that we plan way over kids' heads, and they don't have the scaffolding and the footholds in which to connect the new information that's being presented to the old information. And also, if the teacher has or whoever's providing the instruction has a poor understanding of a cognitive process, may not be able to sequence either a process that's an ABCD, a task completion process, or maybe organize ideas from a micro idea to a macro idea, or whatever that you're trying to do to activate those higher order processes. The teacher may not have the level of understanding of cognitive processes to be able to effectively implement said strategy. So that comes with somewhat of a learning curve. Now, criticism of constructivism, which is my question that I posed in the discussion board, which is if we only experience reality through our senses, okay, and our experiences, and with our senses being inherently fallible, that means that we experience reality in an inherently fallible way. But yet, if our conception of reality is our idea of truth, and truth is the idea of what basically the culmination or the end result of all of our experiences put together and what we think about things, is there a line there where relative truth based on experience can meet objective or universal truths? And this comes into some very, very deep questions that you might want to have with like your friends after a couple beers on a Saturday or something. Like, what is reality? Okay, what is truth? Does truth exist? Is our concept of reality true? And that's, going back, I've already mentioned Rene Descartes a couple times, and if you read some of his work, at the end of his career, he was trying to search for truth, and he realized that he couldn't really prove anything, because we only take in things through our senses, and our senses are inherently fallible. And at the end of the day, he was only able to prove that he himself existed, and that's where you get the idea of I think, therefore I am. So the only thing, we can only prove, in essence, our own reality. So even this great philosopher from for hundreds of years, we haven't come to a settled opinion on what is reality. Does reality even exist? And that's something that philosophers go back and forth on since Plato and Aristotle were battling it out 2,500 years ago. So what's the line, and how do we use that line? It's not so clear, and without a clear understanding of the line, can we clearly, to what extent can we clearly or successfully utilize these types of practices? In some instances we can, in some instances maybe it's not so simple. Now my last one, this isn't my last one. Here's the theorists. If you want to take a look at the theorists, go right ahead. Some of these were just in-text citations from my references. You can take a look at them. Some of them are a little bit more common. So how do we use each of these in a classroom setting? Like Ertmer and Newby said, there is no one specific strategy that's perfect. Quite the opposite. We should be using a multiple array of strategies based on the specific curricular end that we're trying to achieve. So how do we use behaviorism in the classroom? As for our base level rote, memory, recall, or task performance types of learning or skill acquisition or otherwise, as a special educator, we use this a lot in functional skills, like life skills and things like that. In academic skills, it could be memorizing vocabulary words. It could be letter identification, number identification. It could be memorization of your addition facts, subtraction facts, multiplication and division. Things that are universal truths and a base and a foundation of information by which we need to have a certain level of mastery before we hope to progress and use that base level information to achieve more higher order thinking processes and actually apply or generalize that into either existing or new situations. Now, cognitivism. How do we use cognitivism in the classroom? Once again, it's all about the mental processes, okay, on how we learn. So, first of all, is we need to make knowledge meaningful for a student, and we need to do that not just because it's motivating. I mean, it is, but that's I think even more importantly, in order to have new information process and be put into an organized fashion in long-term memory, we need to connect new information to old information. And this is something in the Silber, that when they talk about the actual implementation of cognitivist instruction in general, that we need to use developmentally appropriate instruction, and we need to hit that proximal zone where a student, we have enough activation of prior knowledge so that students have a firm foothold on which to grab on to what it is that we're doing, and we're providing just enough new information that that student is able to successfully internalize that new information without having it be too much too fast. So that's a fine and subtle art, but it really does, it pays dividends in the end, okay, because we want to connect the new information to the old, and we also want to create connections between and across concepts that are both related and not related, so that we can create the most sound neural networks, so that students can organize and sequence and create their own mental algorithms when they're using said information to solve problems, either application or to apply or generalize what they know into specific situations. Now lastly, how do we use the idea of constructivism in the classroom? Like we've said many times before, this is about experience and about context. So the only way we can experience things is through active participation. And that's why I have this nice triangle down here, and I know it takes up a large amount, but it's very important. And so you can see that here at the top, so we basically have two axes, if you will, the one going from bottom left to the top, and then one going from the bottom right to the top, as far as memory and recall, and then activity of involvement. So you can see at the top we have things like reading about things, hearing about things, listening to things, so and so on and so forth. And then at the bottom we start to see more active methods, such as actually doing, simulating, seeing other people simulate, etc. And you see that the more active that the process is, the higher the amount of recall that a student is going to walk away from. And this is important because we want students to walk away with as much retention as possible. And to better facilitate that, we need to provide more active experiences, because if we give them experiences, that's the only way that they're going to be able to question or either affirm or refute their prior experiences, is through new experiences. And if they themselves are participating in whatever it is that we're trying to do, it's going to have a lot more effect, and it's going to be a much greater, if you will, emotional or internalized connection to whatever it is that they're trying to do, than just sitting listening to Professor Yak about it for an hour or something like that. So some ways that we can do that, like I said, active, engaged learning. It could be problem-based learning, where students actually simulate. It could be things like immersive service learning, where students actually go out into the field and learn by doing, case studies, seeing practical applications of a specific problem or whatever, and using what they know to try and come up with solutions. But basically anything where we can have a student actively immerse themselves in an experience so that they can activate their prior experiences, and once again, based on context from the top right, It could be either low ordered or high ordered, depending on the context of the activity, and they can either affirm or refute their concept of what they thought, either low or high ordered, about a specific task, process, idea, or otherwise. So providing those active experiences is going to help really engage those connections and get a student to really question at a higher level and a deeper level what they think they know based on what they're experiencing now. And again, here I got my theorists right here. And I got my references on the bottom. So anyways, thanks for taking a journey with me through my learning matrix. Hopefully it made sense to you, and I look forward to any critiques, criticisms, discussion, or otherwise. I'm just interested in your thoughts about how I conceptualized this activity. So thanks for staying with me, and I look forward to seeing you all in the discussion.